welcome back to our channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Freya's pregnancy, well, my pregnancy with Freya. And this honestly is one of the most asked questions I get is how was our pregnancy? Did we know about Freya's condition before she was born? So I'm excited to tell this story in its entirety so that you guys can understand a little bit more about us. So I have 4 kids. All my other pregnancies were kind of pretty normal. I did bleed with every pregnancy. I did have hyperemesis with every pregnancy. I threw up from the moment that egg implanted until the baby came out. I had to be on 2 or 3 different nausea medications with each of my pregnancies. So when Freya's pregnancy came around, I knew I was pregnant. I was throwing up. I sent my sister a picture of myself cleaning the toilet as a pregnancy announcement because when you're puking 5 times a day, the toilet needs to be clean because you're spending a lot of time in there. And so the time came to take a pregnancy test. It was, I think, the day I was supposed to get my period, maybe the day before. I took a pregnancy test and it was negative, which meant basically nothing to me because I knew I was pregnant because I was so nauseous. So I was like, oh, I'll wait a couple days, take another one. I waited a couple days, took another one. It was negative. And this happened for about a week and a half. At this time, I was working at the hospital on the postpartum floor, which is where you go after you have your baby to kind of recover. And so my OBGYN, I worked with him every day. And I went up to him and I was like, I am pregnant. I know I am pregnant. I have no doubt in my mind that I'm pregnant, but my tests are negative. Like, what do I do? And he's like, well, how long has it been? I said, about a week and a half since I was supposed to start my period. I haven't started yet. And he said, well, wait until the 2-week mark, take a pregnancy test. If it's not positive, you might be miscarrying. There might be something going on. So we'll do some tests then and ultrasounds and see what's going on. So at the 2-week mark, I took a pregnancy test and it finally was positive. So I was like, oh, good. I must have ovulated later than I thought. Everything's great. So come 5 weeks pregnant, I started hemorrhaging. And like I said, I had bled with my other pregnancies, but this was like a 1/4 cup of blood just pouring out of me and then pretty consistent bleeding like a period. And so I figured that I had to have been miscarrying. Called my sisters, absolutely devastated. I have one sister that has had multiple miscarriages and I called her just to see what I could expect from a miscarriage. She told me to call my doctor and I didn't want to. I was sobbing, I was bawling. I wanted this baby so bad. And she's like, you need to call your doctor. And I was like, no, I can't call them sobbing like this. So she actually called my doctor for me and said, you know, my sister thinks she's having a miscarriage. What do you want her to do? And they basically were like, well, she has to be the one to call us. So I finally called them and my doctor had me go in to get my HCG levels tested to see if I was having a miscarriage. So I went to the hospital completely just like bleeding, got my HCG levels and they were a little bit lower than I should have been at that point, but were good. And 2 days later I went and they were, so I was pregnant. So they had me go in for an ultrasound and when they did that ultrasound, they found a sac, but no baby visible in the sac yet. The doctor said this is consistent with a 5-week pregnancy, which at that time I was 6 weeks. he said where you had your late pregnancy test and your levels were a little lower than we thought. I just think that you got pregnant later than you anticipated, and you're not as far along as you think you are. So come back in a week and we'll see where you're at. So I came back in a week for the ultrasound, and there was a baby in there, and he said, okay, come back in another week and we'll see if that baby has a heartbeat. So I came back in another week, baby had a heartbeat. And it's like every time I came, it was a little bit of good news with a little bit of bad news. Like, oh, you're not as far along as you thought, like, come back. Oh, there's baby, but there's no heartbeat, come back. And so every week was just a little better and a little better. I was still very nauseous, which was a great sign for me. I ended up losing about 15 pounds in the first trimester, which is normal for me. So the nausea to me was a good sign that everything was going well, because I am so nauseous with all my other pregnancies. Losing weight is normal. I can't eat anything really. I have to force myself to eat and can only eat small little amounts. Chris was so great. I would get so sick at like 10 o'clock at night. So every night at 9 o'clock, he would bring me something and he'd be like, you have to eat this. And I was like, I don't want to eat it. He's like, I don't care if you want to eat it, you have to eat it. You're going to be sick. So everything was going according to the way my other pregnancies went. They did find in my ultrasounds that I had something called a subchorionic hematoma, which I actually had with Jessie and Freya. They're extremely rare. You usually don't have them for more than one pregnancy, but I had them with all three of my girls. It's basically there's a pocket of blood in the chorion between like your uterus and where the baby is attached. There's a blood clot. And what happens is they can burst and then you bleed. And I had 3 of those with Freya. And so basically they were just monitoring to make sure that those were getting smaller as my pregnancy went on, which they did, and everything was fine with that. So come 23 weeks, I had my anatomy ultrasound, which they usually do them at 21 weeks, but I wanted to do it the same day as my appointment with my OBGYN, just to cut down on appointments. I have 3 kids at home. I had already had a ton of appointments, so I was trying to cut down on those appointments and combine them into one. And I show up for the ultrasound. My husband, Chris, is with me. We left the kids with someone, and they start the scan, and immediately the ultrasound technician was like, okay, let me show you what I'm seeing, which I very much appreciate, because listening to other people's diagnosis stories, there's a lot of the ultrasound tech saying, oh, let me just go grab the doctor. Our ultrasound tech showed us everything she was seeing. And I think Chris and I have very different reactions to this. I had worked with babies for 6 years at this point in the hospital. And so she immediately said, she's missing a couple fingers and a bone in her forearm. That's what I'm seeing. And so my next thought was, okay, well, what else? Because there's usually something else. And so she took us head to toe. Brain looks amazing. Throat looks great. Heart, 4 chambers, looks fantastic. Stomach looks great. Kidneys look great. You know, head to toe. Everything else looks great. So at that point, I was relieved. I was like, oh, it's just a limb difference. That's great. And she's like, okay, so I'll go get the doctor and you'll have your appointment. So we go and meet with the doctor. We had a couple questions for him. He did mention at that time she was about 10 days behind in growth, but he said that's not really concerning at this point. Usually if they're 2 weeks behind, that's when we get concerned. But I do want you to go see the maternal fetal medicine doctor, which is like the specialist. So they called to make an appointment. The appointment was for 2 weeks or 3 weeks later or something. And I then was like, oh, then everything's fine, right? Everything's good. So we get home and we tell our kids, hey, your sister is going to have, and I'm trying to remember, I'm pretty sure we said she's going to have a limb difference like Nemo from Finding Nemo. And my kids immediately were like, oh, Nemo has a lucky fin, so she's gonna have a lucky arm. And we said, yeah, that's it. And at that point, my husband and I, on the way home from the doctor, we live about an hour away from our doctor. And so on the way home from the doctor, we had researched online, limb difference. What are we looking at? We kind of wanted to see another kid with the same limb difference as Freya. And we happened upon the Lucky Fin Project, which is a organization that supports people with limb difference. And that was really good. We looked and we're like, oh, she'll just have a limb difference. Everything else will be fine. It'll be fine. So then I think it was that same day we get home and the maternal fetal medicine doctor calls us directly, said, I'm really concerned about your daughter. I need you to come in sooner than your appointment, 2 weeks. Can you come in tomorrow? And so I went in the next day and he did a scan. She was measuring, I think like 13 days, so pretty close to the 2 weeks behind at that point. And he found a problem with where her placenta was attached. And she had something called low diastolic flow in her umbilical cord. So the way that works is you pump blood into the baby through the umbilical cord. It circulates throughout the baby, and then like the old blood pumps back out to you, and then you filter that and pump new blood back in. And that's how they get their nutrients, that's how they get their oxygen, that's how they get their blood, basically everything. And with Freya, the pressure was really high when she was pumping the blood back to me. So all that old blood to be filtered, pumping back to me, the pressure was so high that she was having to work extra hard to pump the old blood out. And that was causing, he said, her small size. He said she'll just continue to get smaller and smaller, not smaller and smaller, further and further behind where her typical peers would be. And you have to come in every 2 days for an ultrasound to make sure, because basically her body is working so hard and her heart is pumping so hard that any minute she could die, which is not great news when you're 24 weeks pregnant. We actually saw 2 different doctors at the maternal fetal medicine. The first one was fantastic. He was worried about my safety and Freya's safety. He offered us a amniocentesis, which is where they put a needle in, take out some of the amniotic fluid, and they can test for different genetic conditions. I didn't want to do it. There is a risk that they could hit the baby and cause damage. There's a risk that the sac could rupture and you could go into labor. And that to me was just too big of a risk to take. So I said no. First doctor said, I understand. Second doctor comes in the next appointment and tells me how irresponsible I am being, how I should have had all of this done before 24 weeks because now there's nothing we can do. And I'm sitting there going like, there is nothing we can do. Like I wasn't comprehending. I was like, what could we have done before now to help this situation? And then I realized he was talking about getting an abortion, which never crossed my mind. We love Freya from the moment we conceived her. when I was miscarrying, I was devastated. I wanted her so bad. So the second doctor we avoided from there on out. There was a couple times that he had to be the one we had to see, but from then on out we requested the first doctor because he was a little more in line with the way we wanted to do things. So we had to go every 2 days. I had to go every 2 days. Me and Freya had to go every 2 days for an ultrasound. They would check her pressure, they would check her movements to see if she was swallowing amniotic fluid. All of these things tell you, how stressed the baby is. There was a point that the doctor was worried about Freya's heart because he had a pretty strong suspicion that she had a genetic condition, and he couldn't accept the fact that there was nothing else medically going on. She was small, she had a limb difference. He had prepared me basically saying, there has to be something wrong, there has to be something that we're missing. She might be born and we're gonna have to fly her up to Primary Children's, which is our state children's hospital. And so he had me fly up to Primary Children's while I was pregnant to get a prenatal echocardiogram. So basically they do an echocardiogram on Freya while she's still inside me. And so I flew up there for the day. He wanted me to fly because he was afraid if I drove, I'd be too far from a hospital, and then if anything happened, I'd be too far away, because between our town and the children's hospital is basically nothing. It's 3 hours of nothing. And so I flew up there, I got the echocardiogram done, and everything looked great. The doctor there was like, I don't know why he sent you. I looked at the scans he did and everything looks fine. I'll do a scan while you're here to double check. But she said, yes, everything is fine. Her heart is perfect. You don't need another echo when she's born. Everything is great. So I felt like that was the first piece of good news I had had almost my entire pregnancy with Freya. Every doctor's appointment, it was something else is wrong, something else is wrong. And this was my first piece of only good news. They didn't find anything else. It was only good news, and made me really excited. I really felt like Freya just had a limb difference and that her size was all due to the problems with the placenta and the pressure problems. So I had a couple days where I was completely devastated, but most of my pregnancy, I was like, I don't think she has a genetic condition. I just don't. Nothing else, if she did, something else would be wrong, and nothing else is wrong. So I was under the assumption that she just, maybe when I bled, it caused this problem with placenta, and she was small because of that, and she had a limb difference, and if we could just get her here alive, that it would be smooth sailing from there. That doctor basically told me, have a bag packed. You will be admitted. We'll have to deliver the baby. You'll be lucky if you make it to 30 weeks pregnant. So I went every 2 days, and every appointment, the doctor was like, well, it hasn't gotten any worse, so you'll be lucky if you make it. First it was 30 weeks, then it was 32 weeks, then it was 34 weeks. And then eventually, on my last appointment, I was 35 weeks and 4 days pregnant. The results of the test they did were not what they wanted. They couldn't get Freya to be as active as she usually was. And in walks the doctor that I did not agree with. And I said, is the other doctor here? And they said, no, you have to see this doctor today. And so I talked to him. I said, okay, so are we gonna deliver the baby? Because the results weren't great. And he was like, no, we're gonna get to 37 weeks. And I was like, why 37 weeks? Like, her results aren't great. Let's do it. And he was like, and I was crying because she was so small. I was almost 36 weeks pregnant, and the ultrasound was estimating she was 3 pounds, 12 ounces. And I knew, because I worked at the hospital, the baby has to be 4 pounds to come up to the mom baby floor. And that was my biggest goal. Like, I just wanted her to be with me. I didn't want to have to be separated. And he said, no, we're gonna make it for 37 weeks. I'm gonna plan your C-section, because she was breech, so we knew she would have to be a C-section. He said, I'll plan your C-section for 37 weeks. I'll be there, the NICU team will be there, your doctor will be there, and kind of walked me through everything. You know, we'll take her immediately to the NICU, all of that. So I go home. I cried and cried because I just was like, I can't be pregnant for another week and a half. There's no way. And I just was very upset. So 2 days later, I woke up and I felt some leaking of fluid. And that starts Freya's birth story. So we'll do that next time.